I think the next speaker doesn't really need an introduction. I think many of you will know who this is. Mr. Stephen Short, if you would like to come forward, or Shorty, as he's better known. Shorty is the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest lead at Save a Life for Scotland, and is going to talk now about resuscitation decisions.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. How are we? Good. Yeah, good. So some brilliant speakers and me for the next 20 minutes. So, so I'm going to revisit something from a decade ago. Some of you might remember 10 years ago, this stage here, where we stood, and we had a great event, did lots of kind of cool stuff. And over that 10 years, quite a lot has happened. In fact, on that day 10 years ago was the day after the Brexit vote. And there was a fairly bizarre mood in the room. The NHS obviously became rich beyond its wildest dreams with £350 million a day. Oh, wait a minute, that never happened. We've had about half a dozen prime ministers, God knows how many elections for goodness knows what. And of course, we had the small matter of a global pandemic during that 10 years with all the absolute madness that came with that. Things like first name terms with Marcus and Leanne, DPD and Amazon respectively. Usually when they were delivering my wine delivery so I could get wrecked with my mates 3 nights a week over Zoom in the COVID arms, which was all very bizarre, really. But as Andy's already said, it had a massive impact on us in the cardiac arrest world. Right across the world, we all saw our outcomes plummet. And actually, this decision-making stuff played a large part of that as well. You'll know from inquiries that are ongoing, DNA CPR comes up a lot, and how decisions were made and talked about and all that kind of stuff. So COVID had a huge impact on us over these years. But actually, to be fair, I also jumped on this bandwagon and got a puppy. So it wasn't all bad news. And then Mrs. Clegg met Charlie, and Dr. Clegg found himself with a puppy as well. And I'm not sure he's fully recovered from that, if I'm honest. But actually, very deliberately 10 years ago on this stage, we wanted to talk about this stuff. And this was the title slide, because I didn't work for the ambulance service then, so it seemed less controversial. I was still in NHS Lothian, only just a resus officer, and I think that's important, because the stuff I'm talking about here today impacts hospitals as much as it does out of hospital. You can ignore that bottom bit, because I've left that cesspit of misery and doom as well, so you won't find that Twitter handle anywhere anymore unless someone else has nicked it. And that deliberate part of the conversation was all about trying to make us think about who we should and who we shouldn't be resuscitating. And we started with this kind of stuff. And some of you might remember this in GR Calc, this pretty arbitrary paragraph, really. And this was about it, despite the fact we were trying to encourage all clinicians out there to think about the appropriateness of the resuscitation attempt they're providing. This was all you had. And you know, we did a lot of extra work. We were introducing 3RU at pace by now when the ambulance service, and quite a large chunk of 3RU training is about decision making. We introduced our advanced practitioners in critical care and actually learned a lot during the pandemic in terms of their support to clinicians out there for decision making, to cardiac arrest that we're actively responding to. And we still see that continuing today on the critical care desk. But perhaps most importantly, we should give a shout out to this team within SCAS. So Paul and Scott and Sandra, Kerry, Robbie, Caitlin, Tom and Amanda. I hope I've not missed any of them. But the amazing work. Honestly, this is my favourite work stream in the Scottish Ambulance Service by an absolute mile. The importance of this work is huge. And over the last probably 6 or 7 years now, the amount of effort and work they've put in with face-to-face sessions to talk about let's do the right stuff, and that involves decision-making at end of life and not subjecting people to treatment that's never going to work has been huge. However, the slightly depressing part of that story is it's not really had a single bit of impact on the number of people that we actively resuscitate as an ambulance service every year. So a lot of effort, a lot of enthusiasm to do stuff and do the right thing, but actually, in quite a crude measure, let's be honest about it, worked arrests every year, it's effectively stayed exactly the same throughout that entire decade. And that's in the back of feedback coming to us all the time to say, we're in that living room, we know it's not the right thing to do, but we didn't feel like we could stop for various reasons. And I think our decision now is taking a slightly different path. So coming back to, I think it was your question, Ross, I'm sure it was your voice. What are some of the challenges? If you want my opinion about Scandinavia, they've got the denominator better. They're better at not resuscitating people who are not going to survive cardiac arrests. And I think there is a challenge with our denominators, not just out of hospital in the UK, but in hospitals as well. How often, for those of you that have come from a hospital background, have you been in that position around that hospital bed where you're thinking, what are we doing here? We've all been in that position. And difficult decision-making, difficult conversations. Conversations done badly, oh, you need to sign a DNA CPR form. What? No, you don't. What's that all about? You never need to sign a DNA CPR form. So, we're digging into this. We're trying to work out what's going on. This I'm about to show you is very, very provisional stuff. It is work ongoing, okay? But we've taken, oh, hello, work, there you go. We've taken 500 cases of cardiac arrests that were worked arrests where the person hasn't survived, and we've been analysing them. So this is our initial data. So this is nowhere near ready for publication yet. But of that, there's a pretty stark story in there, isn't there? So 40% of what ended up being 457 cases by the time you get rid of stuff. So far, about 40% of them have got markers for obvious futility or possible futility. Remember, these are people that have had a full resuscitation attempt, 40% of them. So talking about that denominator that probably feels like it's not right, the number of people we actively resuscitate, I think this is starting to give us a bit more evidence and data and understanding of why we're doing it. And the reason I say understanding is because when you dig into the actual free text on these things, almost universally when you're reading them, there's one word that jumps out to me. And that's confidence of clinicians to make these decisions on someone who you've never met before, on their living room floor, when you're surrounded by understandably incredibly distressed loved ones. And what do you do? And this isn't a new thing. This is a well-trodden path. So these are only 4 of probably the most recent papers published on this in a massive back catalogue in the literature that talks about decision-making, particularly in the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest environment. And actually, if you condense it all down, it probably fits into these 5 key messages. Most of these papers have some really interesting quotes in them, but there's one that stood out to me quite a lot, which says, doing CPR reduces my chance of being hit with a shitty stick. And I'm sure most ambulance clinicians in the room are familiar with that phrase. I can say with some confidence, if you don't do CPR and it's an appropriate thing to do within the Scottish Ambulance Service, and actually within any ambulance service in the UK, you won't get hit with it. But I think that risk asymmetry at the bottom, I think, is an important part. So, what are we going to do about this? We've got lots of literature, we've got local evidence, we've got a long back catalogue of trying to make a difference, but not so far having made the difference, which brings us up to where we are in 2026 with the new termination of resuscitation in adults. So there's a few of us in the room today that have been involved with this stuff. And I think what you have here now is something we've not necessarily had before, which is evidence-based guidance on these decisions. So most of this work is based on the protected study, which isn't quite published yet. It's going through its final peer review, but we did have the principal investigator on the group with us writing this guidance. And it's been interesting introducing it, because we've had a lot of this feedback. It's not the headline, okay? Put this into real life. So when I get woken up at 3 in the morning when I'm on call for a decision support conversation with a crew, who you're usually met with, that's how I answer the phone at 3 in the morning, just for some of you might have been on the other end of that call. I can't think I've ever had a phone call where they've said, we've been resuscitating someone for about 25 minutes and we think we should stop. What I get almost all the time is, I've been resuscitating this person for an hour now. This is everything we've done, and we've run out of ideas, and there's nothing else I can do. I think in real life, in reality, work as done, not work as imagined, when we are understanding that this is the right kind of person to be resuscitating, we do it for a prolonged period of time. We probably just don't realise we are in most of those situations. Okay? And in fact, if you look at your JR-Cal cap and you dip into it and you look at those key points at the start of every single one, at no point in any of these key points can you see anything mentioned about 45 minutes. So it's been the headline, but it's not a key point to this guideline. The key point to this guideline is stuff about best interest decisions and futility and chances of risk and will it work and all that kind of stuff. So let's put it into reality, and some of you will remember Bert, because you've met Bert before. So Bert was a legend. He was my wife's granddad. Died when he was 96. Haven't had a great life. He was born in Wales. Used to make me drink Penderyn whiskey. Oh. Should come with Gaviscon as a mixer. But you had to say yes. Spent most of his adult life in Kelso in the Borders, where he met his wife, but was widowed quite young, and for the last 20 years of his life, spent it down in Luke and Liam's neck of the woods in east of England, actually shacked up with his girlfriend, the dirty old dog. And Bert died at home. An amazing death. You know, he'd had a great life, but suddenly heart failure caught up with him when he was old, and it progressed quickly, and he died peacefully in his house. He had lots of input from East of England Ambulance Service, actually, who would, before just-in-case meds being used by ambulance service were really a thing, was getting all the kind of right stuff. I think, unfortunately, we end up at Bert in crisis too often, and sometimes it doesn't go right, because we need to decide where we're going with Bert when we get there. Are we going full-on Elves freshwater, funky-haired wham with Bert, having taken him off his hospital bed in the living room, probably found by their carer, and still continue to do now 45 minutes of resuscitation? Or actually, are we going to spend a bit of time thinking about those key points within the guidance that's available to us to try and avoid putting Bert through the probably less desirable thing that's happening right now? So if we look at some of these key points, sounds really easy, doesn't it? We need to aim to differentiate between patients who've died and those where there's a chance to restore life. When you've just driven there quickly, you've never met the person before, you've got no idea what the house looks like when you're walking into it, let alone what you're going to see when you get there, and you're trying to take on all this information. Do you even notice there's a bed in the living room, let alone it's a hospital bed, or the just-in-case meds that are lying in the corner that the family have lost the ability to tell you about because they're so upset and distressed at this point? It's really difficult. However, there is stuff within this guidance that's there to help you. And it talks about, you know, consider all the different factors. I'm not sure what the difference between frailty and advanced frailty is, but anyway, likelihood of risk. What are their wishes? You know, a patient's known and expressed wish is a really valuable tool for us as clinicians in this situation when we're putting all these little bits and pieces together so that we can try and make that decision in the best interest of Bert and others like him. Because we understand that actually a lot of these conditions are incompatible with life. And so for those conditions and for those patients, the right thing to do probably isn't 45 minutes of life support. There is a really helpful caveat within all this as well, though, is sometimes we just don't know. And I think an important message to get over is 45 minutes isn't a definite time. You don't have to follow 45. You don't watch that clock timing you because you want to get that defib switched off. You do 45 minutes as a minimum when it's appropriate to resuscitate someone. If it's not appropriate, and that becomes clear during the resuscitation attempt, even when you're at the point of advanced interventions, if it's obvious it's not going to be appropriate, off ramp from what you're doing and stop the resuscitation attempt earlier than that. All of that's there to help you and support you to choose the right path, full-on resuscitation, not to resuscitate or to stop resuscitation earlier because it's not the right thing to do. So there's some key points within it. It's not about 45 minutes anymore. Ignore the time, okay? The time's only appropriate when it's appropriate that you're resuscitating someone properly. Have they died, or as Elle said, they're trying to be alive? One of the big decisions. And is what you're doing in the best interest of that patient? Is that patient going to go to hospital, going to go to critical care, go through that challenging journey for them, and come out of the other side of that to be able to function as close to they were before they had their cardiac arrest? Is that something we can achieve for this person? And if it's not, the right thing to do is to stop. And I want to finish by flipping this slightly today. I don't necessarily want you to ask me questions, although you're very welcome to at any point today. I want to ask you a question. And I don't want the answer to it just now. I want you to think about it and reflect on it, and then I do want you to answer it. Because we want to know, organisationally, not just in SCAS, but right across the NHS, not just in Scotland, but the whole UK, what can we do mostly to increase your confidence, to help you with this decision-making in a really difficult point in a patient's care? And I'm going to stop there and say thank you for listening to me.